What is good, SDS? We have a very special guest today. First time on the channel and long overdue. We got Jessie Naylor from Last Second Sports in the building, and we got a lot to talk about today. Kyle Shanahan, quarterbacks, you know how it works, all the good stuff. And we're going to get into it right after this. Let's go. Smash that like button if you haven't already. Love to see it. Gammon says this show is about to be lit, and I think he's right because I'm really excited to finally get. Jesse, we've been going back on Twitter for a long time, and of course, you're a fellow 49ers content creator, but we finally got you on over. How you doing, man? What are the vibes like?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. The vibes are on level 10 after that intro. That gets you hyped. It's not a long one, but it gets you hyped for sure. It doesn't have to be that long, but I'll just put it like this, man. I'm a fan of yours. First time caller, long time listener. What's up, man?
Yeah, bro. We've seen you in the chat around here. I think one of the last times you were like in the chat, I was like, damn, I just got to get Jesse on here. We got to start talking about some stuff. But as you guys know, man, there's so much going on in the 49ers community. And of course, Jesse does a phenomenal job covering it. And, we do what we can do to get it done. But I want to take a step back a little bit because I want to learn a little bit about Jesse. How did you get into 49ers content creating? Like how did this all start? I'm always interested to kind of hear people's stories because you're independent. Like I know you write for SI and do that stuff now, but like at one point you're independent. How did you get on this path?
Oh man, I had a podcast like 6-7 years ago, and it was me and a couple buddies, and it just kind of fell off. I had moved across the country, and podcasting's cool, but there's no interaction with anybody. You just, okay, I go and I look at my downloads and my listens, and that's it. But then I came across this YouTube thing. I came across Grant actually and saw he did his call-in thing. I'm like, all right. So figured out how to call into his show. And I'm like, hold on a second. What's this StreamYard thing? So I just started geeking out on it, learning about StreamYard, just started teaching myself thumbnails and intros and all sorts of stuff, man. And it just kind of took off from there. So that was about 2 years ago now at this point. And I'm glad. I'm glad I do it. I wish I would have known earlier. I wish I would have started earlier. But that was kind of it, man. Just I've always had the passion for it, but not knowing exactly how to get into it and how to go about everything really kind of held me back. And I think that's where a lot of people are, man. The fear of not knowing what to do or not having the right equipment, or what if I sound stupid and nobody watches? All those things are going to happen. You just got to get going.
100%. Like that's why it took me so long, and I started doing like really diving into this in like 2021, and I'd had my page going since like 2017. I didn't like being on camera. I didn't like the idea of speaking into a microphone. It was funny. I had a podcast too, just with my boys as like a hobby. And like I had my platform, but I would never post it because I'm like, I don't want people to listen to me talk. Like I don't, they don't give a crap what I'm saying, but that is a huge part of it, right? Just kind of getting over it, kind of getting on the mic, and then the rest is kind of history from there. You now have 10,000 subs on your channel, and I know you've even had to restart because of issues or whatnot, but the fact that you're back at 10, and that's phenomenal, man. Like, I really do hope people, like, we got my guy right here saying, who's this? This is Jessie Naylor. You better tap in with his channel. I put his information in the description. Just shoot him a sub, because one of the things that I love about you, Jesse, is like on Twitter, at least, like we don't even agree all the time. But
Right.
what I do love is you get conversations going. You get me thinking about things, and like I might come back and be like, hey, Jesse, I don't necessarily agree with this, but it creates such a great conversation. And that's what I love about content creators, right? Like when they say like, well, what is content creation? It's like, if you can start a conversation like with your Trent Williams thing, like where that thing went mega viral, right?
Yeah.
Like I didn't like necessarily agree that was a big deal, but what I freaking loved is for one moment we had a spotlight on offensive line technique. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. We had all the big dogs chiming in, like your stuff's going crazy viral. I thought that was fantastic. Like, and I think that's the immense value that you bring to our space is like, there's everyone goes about it a certain way, right? But it's like you've done such a good job of like being able to start conversations. And I think that's super underrated. And I think you do a really good job of that, man.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it. It's funny because when that Trent Williams stuff was popping off, the first like day, I knew it was going crazy, but it was the notifications were coming through so fast. I didn't even know that NFL players were responding or had retweeted it or had made videos about. I
Like,
didn't
I'm
even
gonna mute this.
Vish reached out and was like, "Hey, like this person's talking about." I'm like, "Really? I didn't see any of that. It was all going so quick." And then, of course, there's a bunch of hate that comes along with it. Still comes along with it, but I think you just have to not be afraid to step out on a limb. And a lot of people get frustrated with it. They're like, "Oh, you're doing this for clicks and whatever." And not really. I just have an opinion. I throw it out there. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, no problem. But Twitter doesn't pay us. I will say this though: if you're a content creator and knowing that Twitter doesn't really pay you, and at least for me, I don't know about you, I'm sure that you have ways to check it out, but I don't get a lot of crossover from Twitter to YouTube. If I post something on Twitter, I don't get a lot of views picked up on YouTube because of it. It's two different audiences. But what I've started to do is I just throw my takes out on Twitter. I don't pay attention to what anybody's saying about it. But if it goes crazy, then I go, all right, that's probably something I should make a video about, or that should be a topic. If nobody talks about it, I'm like, maybe that's not something to talk about. So I'm kind of using it as like a jumping off platform for the YouTube content creation.
Yeah, no, that's really smart because like even with like Instagram, like I have a really big following on Instagram, and you
Yeah.
think that would translate to Facebook, which I'm building a following too. Out of all the followers that I had, there's like maybe 3% that follow me on both. And like
Yeah.
I didn't really even think about that. I was like, oh, everyone's gonna, like no. So you have a different opportunity, and each platform has its like own purpose, right? And like Twitter is one of those things where there's not a lot of nuance, right? So it's like you gotta think of all this information that made you come to this opinion, but you just got to put it out there. And
Right.
sometimes people like get it, sometimes people don't. Sometimes you have to explain it more. Sometimes people just call you a big dummy, or you're like, "Oh, this is like fantastic. Like you nailed it." Right? So Twitter definitely has its spot, but I think what you're doing makes a lot of sense. You kind of get a sense of like how people are responding. You're like, all right, I can now take this to YouTube and we can generate even more content and more discussion about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that you do it too, but you might as well stream across all the platforms, even though you don't necessarily get paid. Meet people where they want to be met. If people prefer to be on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, then let them watch it there. Get your name out there one way or another. Let people know who you are. It may pay off in the end. You never know where paths can cross or who's watching and who's not. And it's just meet people where they want to be met, regardless. It would be a piece of advice I could give.
100%. And again, like we don't always see eye to eye, but the way you go about it, like you can tell, you're just like, man, this is my opinion. And I'm not trying to be disingenuous or anything like that. Like, this is how I feel. This is the reasonings. And I'm like, I respect the hell out of you, man, for the way you go about it. So I'm glad that we finally get you in the building to be able to talk some Niners football. And so what I kind of want to start with, and we're already got some questions coming from the chat, and so far it does to seem to be about Brandon Ayuk, and we will get to Brandon Ayuk, but let's kind of start kind of from a global perspective, and then we'll drill down. what is kind of like your global take right now after we've seen the 49ers move through free agency, the way the roster's constructed? Obviously, we know there's a million questions at quarterback, and we'll definitely drill into that as well. But kind of like more on the other parts of the roster, how are you feeling about what the San Francisco 49ers have done up until this point?
Yeah, I think the 49ers did kind of what we expect them to do. The last few years, it seems like they go one big guy, that's their target. They lock them down, and then they fill out the rest of the roster. I will say that there are times throughout this offseason where I looked at it and didn't necessarily understand why they would let a certain player go. You look at a guy like Emmanuel Mosley was a great example of that. I'm like, man, he got paid probably half of what a lot of us thought he could get, especially on a 1-year prove it deal. Why not bring him back? And there's a lot of things that go into that. Maybe they were only willing to match and he didn't want to come back. Maybe he asked for $8 million from the 49ers. Maybe he just didn't want to be here. There's no way to know for sure, but you look at some of those things, you're like, oh man, I don't know. I don't necessarily see the plan here, but then you fast forward a couple days later, they make a couple other signings. You're like, okay, now it's all starting to feel itself out and put itself together, and it makes a lot of sense. I look at the 49ers, and I think right now, if I were to just assess them at the roster they ended the season with, I think they might be slightly worse potentially, but then there's this sophomore group that you always get every year. And if you have 3, 4, 5 of these guys pop off from last year that you didn't see, all of a sudden they're better. So it really, I've come to a point the last couple years where I'm definitely going to give my opinion on everything that happens. But in the back of my mind, I really am starting to trust the regime when it comes to this decision making, because they are seeing these other guys at play. They know who's ready that we may not know about. Maybe they're looking at a Nick Zakel or a Kalia Davis or a Woolmack or anybody, any of those guys, and saying, hey, this guy, you don't know yet, but he's going to be a big time player for us next year. You just wait. And so you're stressed about it now and you're wanting us to go sign this guy or that guy. We don't need to. We got this guy waiting. So I've tried my best, even though at times I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with this, guys. I think overall, I am putting my trust more so in the front office than what I would have maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think I can say the same thing as well, because I think when the 49ers told me, hey, we're going to start Jake Brendel at center, and after Alex Mack retires and all that stuff, and I'm just thinking like, I don't know Jake Brendel. You hear the story, right? Journeyman. He's been on like multiple teams. He's started 3 games, and you're like, oh, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, and so I wasn't like overly critical, but I definitely had my questions. I was like, man, I would love to see a blue chip center get plugged right into the middle of Kyle's scheme and see this offense start to pick up. And again, you had the Banks first year starter, Burford first year starter, and you're just like last year with the offensive line, like, and Forster, if like you noticed the reports from training camp and all that type of stuff, they were rotating guys like
Yeah.
crazy. And I was like, as an offensive lineman, I'm like, and you know how I get about a line, right? I'm like, keep them there, don't move them, like quit rotating them.
We need
And
continuity. What are you doing?
continuity. And I was like, what's happening here? So I've same thing. Like I had to take a step back and be like, all right, clearly Jake Brendel turned into a Pro Bowl alternate, so I can't be too upset at that. Aaron Banks came in, played phenomenally well. Burford showed he has potential and the capability to play in this league, still has some room to get better and improve. And like you talked about, kind of there is a group of sophomores where we don't know. Like, look at Talanoa Hufanga's ascension from year 1 to his sophomore year. Like, I liked Talanoa Hufanga, I think, a little bit more than a majority of other people, but I had, if I would have been, all
No
pro
idea.
Talanoa, like, no, like, not even close. Like, so I agree that there is part of this like roster building process that who's in house that could improve. And if you had to pick a name of maybe someone from this sophomore kind of class that could step into a much larger role, who would you kind of build that guy that maybe we should be keeping our eye out on for taking that kind, maybe not Talanoa Hufanga-esque type
For
jump,
sure.
but just a jump in general?
Man, there's so many candidates. I think the obvious one is like, okay, well, Drake Jackson's going to get a legit chance to start. So just going off of pure snaps or what I think would probably happen, I think he's kind of an obvious one, but I don't know what it is about Kalia Davis, and I know that they've got a log jam there, but I just feel like there's something coming from this kid. I could see a scenario, and I know that, Kinlaw's working really hard. I wish him the best. It just, things haven't really pieced themselves together. I could see a scenario where it's coming down to one of those two for a roster cut, and Davis takes it and contributes this year. I just like his athletic profile. I like short fat daddies in the middle that are super athletic, and he fits all those things. He's got that. I don't want to go crazy and say he's this, but he has like a Warren Sapp profile to him where it's like, well, maybe, he's an uber athlete, undersized, but also, big. I don't know. I like him, and I've got a feeling that he's going to do something this year, and he's going to force his way up the depth chart.
He's got a little bit of that DJ Jones to him. I know it was that was an easy comp when he was drafted, because obviously DJ Jones just signed was like a $20 million contract with the Broncos. And, if we felt like we saw that writing on the wall that they probably weren't going to be able to retain DJ, and then they go out and kind of get a guy in a similar round. I think Khalil was a 6th-round pick, right?
Mm-hmm.
DJ Jones was a 6th-round pick. They get that. And what was your name for him? The squatty body or whatever.
Yeah. Fat daddies.
Fat daddies. I love that, because when you look at Kalia, like, he has that short squatty body from a defensive tackle. I know like some fans will look at the 6'5", 320 and be like, that's what a defensive interior tackle should look like. From my experience, and of course, you see other guys across the league like a DJ Jones. I'm not going to comp him at all to Aaron Donald, but you do see what can happen when you get a strong, very fast first step and stout defensive tackle on the interior. They can mess things up. And being a former center myself, I always give this example. I was like, I'd always much rather prefer going up against 6'5", 320 than 6'2", 295, because those guys are typically strong enough and have the leverage. And when I'm a center and I'm snapping it and they're already in my chest, they can really mess things up at the point of attack. So I like that pick. I think Kalia Davis could potentially be a guy that has a role. And I mean, you look at the guys that they also brought back. T.Y. McGill had to step in. He actually did pretty well, all things considering, being a mid-year pickup. And then Kevin Givens comes back, so that was another good get. And then Javon Hargrave. Like, what do you think about his addition to that defensive line? And does that give you a little bit more like reminiscent of the 2019 defensive line? Or like, well, what are you thinking about with Javon being the centerpiece? And of course, you have guys like Kalia who can do the rotation.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely gives you 2019 vibes, although it could be a little bit better because Bosa was a rookie that year. And I know the name is the same. It's still Bosa versus Bosa, but Bosa going into the 2023 season is much different than Bosa coming into his rookie year. These are two completely different.
We were afraid that Bosa was even going to be healthy his rookie year.
Right.
Remember? Because he had the ankle.
Yep. So but I will say that 2019 line was very, very good. But it was special when D Ford was playing. If you remember the splits of when D Ford was in versus when he was not, how much more often they were around the quarterback, it was insane. The 49ers need that speed rusher opposite of Bosa, that pure speed rusher, that Hassan Reddick type of player, because that's what makes the rest of it tick. So we'll see if that can be Jackson. We'll see if they get it in the draft. we'll see. I mean, a guy like Yannick Ngakoue is still available. We'll see if he ends up here potentially. But I really think if this defensive line is going to wreak the havoc that we think it can, it will reach its highest potential if they can get a pure speed rusher on the outside to help things out.
Jesse, it's what I've wanted for the longest time. Don't get me started on Brian Burns, but I agree 100%. Like when you go back to that 2000, and I always talk about it, that 2019 team, that defensive line, like it was DeForest Buckner, Eric Armstead, and Bosa, and them just creating constant pressure and destroying things from the interior on that defensive line. And of course, you had Richard Sherman. No one would throw it to Richard Sherman, but you had like Fred Warner wasn't even Fred Warner yet. We didn't even call him All Pro Fred yet. Like we were still like he was still blossoming into his own. And that's why
Quan Alexander that year, Brad, was supposed to be the spotlight linebacker, right?
You're right. And then we had rookie Dre Greenlaw, right? Just getting his feet wet. Undrafted free agent Emmanuel Mosley, like you talked about earlier, on the other side. And you had Kwaski and Jimmy Ward in the back end. So it's like when you look at the way that defense is built, and then you kind of comp it to this year's defense, you got a lot of the same pieces, but those players are now fully entrenched at being arguably the best at their position. You add Mooney Ward, obviously Talanoa enters in. We'll see what goes on with that safety position. It'll be interesting to see if they address it in the draft. But I'm with you, man. I want to see that speed on the edge. I want to see D Ford reincarnated because unfortunately the injuries cut his career short. But you are 100% right. When he was in there, the win percentage of that defensive group with him in was unbelievable, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was unstoppable, absolutely unstoppable. And actually, shout out to Quan Alexander because you're right. Quan Alexander. So he was the guy that year that was supposed to be the linebacker, and that was Greenlaw's rookie year. I see that Greenlaw really took on that mentality from Quan Alexander, and even Fred Warner to a certain extent is kind of molded into that. Quan Alexander, although you could say he was overpaid for the year he was here and it didn't work out, and maybe it was a bust of a signing. Just looking at that mentality he brought to that linebacking core and that leadership for that 1 year, you still see the remnants of him through those other players. They've picked up on that energy, just that infectious leadership clearly came from Quan Alexander. That signing was fully worth it for that reason alone.
Well, even now, every time the linebackers do their pregame, like, they get in the circle, that was Quan Alexander's thing. He was the one in the center. He
Yep.
was the one getting the linebackers all going. Now Dre Greenlaw has taken over that role. It wasn't Fred Warner, to your point. It was Greenlaw. And Greenlaw does have that kind of mentality where it's like Hot Boys University, right? Like these boys are active. And, Fred Warner, Dre Greenlaw. Well, I think a position that will be interesting to see is who that Aziz Al-Shair replacement is. Like, is Oren Burks just slide right in? Is it going to be Marcelino McCrary Ball?
That's the one.
Who's it going to be? If you had to be a betting man, who do you think kind of takes over that role next year, or at least has a good shot to?
Yeah, I would say by the mid or end of season, McCrary Ball will have separated in that spot. I love everything about him athletically. And it was one of those things where it's like, okay, you snuck him onto the practice squad, you were able to keep him around. Not a lot of people are going to talk about it, but it's one of those moves that if you're really paying attention, you're like, oh, this is the future here. And he fits perfectly with what the 49ers want to do. I am really excited to see what he brings to the table this next year.
Absolutely. He balled out in preseason and, of course, throughout training camp. And you really got to see, the 49ers just have this knack for developing undrafted free agent players. Like it doesn't always pan out, obviously, because it's kind of hit or miss, but I believe they put a huge emphasis on developing players. Would you agree with that, with your assessment?
Oh, that's one of the things that I praise Shanahan for. And listen, there's a lot that I criticize Shanahan for, but some of the things that you cannot criticize him for is player development, coaching development, just development in general. He's got it on lock. I mean, there's players every year that come up from the year prior that contribute, who came kind of out of nowhere. You didn't see it coming. They do a great job of it. And it seems like every single season they're hitting on a late round draft pick. That's not normal. Organizations don't do that.
Like Kittle 5th round. Like, I mean, just go down. We don't have to
You
go
talked
down.
about DJ Jones,
Yeah. Like, it's crazy.
Tofunga.
It's crazy. But the 49ers, I think, from a roster standpoint, outside the most important position in football, is pretty locked in for the most part. I wanted to ask you one quick question about the edge, because you kind of alluded to it. I've had this question. I've posed it to, the subscribers on my channel, and I'll pose it to you. Like, why do you think edges are still out there? Like, why is Frank Clark, Jadeveon Clowney, Yannick Ngakwe, I mean, Justin Houston? It feels like the list just goes on of guys you think would be day 1, day 2, day 3 signees. Now it feels like teams are just waiting out for the draft to play out and then might go pick up one of these guys. Do you kind of get that sense as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with where a lot of these guys are at in their career. A lot of these guys are approaching 30 or on the other side of 30, maybe have a year left or are playing for a 1-year deal. And so they've got to see the landscape. And teams that are going to take a chance on them for a year or maybe 2 years are going to want to see how the draft plays out as well. They don't want to handcuff themselves. So you've got this crop of players that are a little bit older, very, very talented, but they've got to wait. They've got to wait to see how this thing shakes out from these other teams. And if they get a guy, all of a sudden they can cross that team off their list. So I just think it's the perfect storm of older players playing probably for a 1-year deal. The edge class is actually pretty decent as well. And so you've just got to kind of wait it out. I will say this, though, Brad, and I don't know if you've noticed this. I really thought, for the most part, outside of a couple players got paid a lot less in free agency across the board than what I expected in a lot of position groups.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It was kind of an interesting period. Like, I thought with the cap rising, kind of getting out of the COVID era, like it felt like it's like, all right, we're going to see some pretty explosive deals. It felt kind of tempered. I was like, I was expecting more fireworks, I guess. But
Yeah.
it was okay. I mean, obviously the 49ers go out and get arguably one of the best defenders in the NFL. Outside of that, it was retaining their own guys and bringing in depth and kind of filling out the roster. Um, as we kind of transition out of like looking at the roster as a whole and the draft coming up, what position groups would you consider being kind of a top priority to kind of
Oh,
address and
man.
even
Yeah.
fill?
I mean, 49ers, we just talked about it. They could certainly use an edge. They could probably use another offensive lineman, a versatile offensive lineman, somebody that can play multiple positions potentially. They certainly are probably going to need to draft a quarterback at some point with Brock Purdy out as long as he is. And it sounds like they're going to trade Trey Lance. So, that's a done deal. They're going to need a quarterback when that happens. So there's that. And then, kicker might be a possibility. Corner. They need another outside corner. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people went into last year's draft, Brad, and they're like, oh, there's no way they're picking 10 players or whatever it was that they had. And then they stayed put. They didn't make any moves and they picked 10 players. Now this year you're looking at it going, there's no way they're drafting all 11 spots. And you're like, oh, are you sure about that? Because it feels like there's a lot of position groups that they need for backup. They could use a safety. They could use a corner. They could use an edge, an offensive lineman, a kicker, a quarterback. Hell, another receiver potentially. I mean, there's a lot of tight end. A second tight end would be nice. So
2 would be fantastic.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. I mean, I really could see them drafting all 11 spots. So we'll see.
Yeah, it's funny because I be doing these mock drafts and stuff, and like obviously I'm trading a lot, but I still end up with a lot of picks, and I still find like justification of why I should draft all these guys. I'm like, I see a spot for you here, spot for you there. Minimum, add some competition, maybe push a guy out, like, just elevate the position. But it'll be fascinating to see. I'm really excited, at least from the overall roster standpoint. And you kind of alluded to it. So I think it's time that we take the binge into the quarterback conversation. Obviously, takes everywhere, projections everywhere, and rightfully so. With this many questions around the San Francisco 49ers quarterback spot since 2017, we have to assume that's just par for the course at this
What
point.
it is.
Right. We don't know who quarterback one is. So obviously there's been some recent talk about potentially trading Trey Lance. One, do you think that is real? Or let me back up a little bit. Do you think that is a real possibility? Two, do you think it would be the smart move? And three, what is just kind of your overview of if they were to do that?
Yeah, I actually think it is a possibility for sure. I mean, it depends on what happens. I look at a team like the Colts, I think are a great example. They're sitting at 4. To me, there's a clear drop off. You look at these top 4 quarterbacks, Will Levis is way behind the other 3. I don't think they're even in the same category. So if you're the Colts and you can't get up to 3 and pick swap with Arizona and somebody jumps you and takes, let's say, Bryce Young or Richardson, and you're stuck with Levis, are you going to go Levis at 4, or are you going to get a Will Anderson or something like that, and then say, hey, we'll give you pick 35 for Trey Lance? You look at a coach like Shane Steichen, who just went through it with Hurts. He's not on a hot seat. He just got there. He's got time. He's probably looking at a guy like Trey Lance going, yeah, I can work with that. We'll figure some things out with Trey Lance. So I look at a team like that. All it takes is one. So maybe if the Colts come calling with pick 35, I could see a scenario like that. I would say it's not as likely to happen during the draft. Here's the scenario that I see playing out. And Larry and I had this conversation where we talked about how the quarterback room doesn't make sense. And I agree with that. If Purdy comes back, you've got Darnold, you've got Lance. I mean, all 3 of these guys want to start if possible. It doesn't make a lot of sense. What does, however, make a lot of sense is having Trey Lance compete or whatever they're going to do. If he ends up starting for you and playing well, maybe he's your starter, kind of surprisingly, and Sam Darnold can get traded before the deadline to a quarterback needy team when Purdy's back. Or, hey, you know what? Trey Lance, we tried it. He couldn't even beat out Darnold. There is no future for him here. I think you've already driven his value down a little bit anyways by saying he's even competing with Sam Darnold. So who cares? Wait through training camp, see if you've got anything there. And when a quarterback needy team comes calling, you can trade one of those guys. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. I do imagine that they either bring in an undrafted free agent or they probably even draft a guy. And at that point, when Purdy comes back, one of these guys has to go. It's going to be Sam or it's going to be Trey. And it comes down to really what they think of these guys at that time. But I could see it happening more early in the season, closer to that trade deadline, before I could see it happening in the draft. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense because, to your point, if they were to trade Trey prior to the draft without truly understanding where Brock is, now they probably have a projection of where Brock will be, and by all accounts, it sounds positive. But hey, we know a thing or two about injury flare ups being fans of the San Francisco 49ers. So it's also one thing that you don't necessarily want to hang your hat on. At least that's how I would kind of perceive it. But if you say you trade Trey before the draft, they decided it's whatever, like for whatever reason, whether it's the value that they get or what have you, you're back to having only one quarterback. And you need, I would say, 4 quarterbacks through OTAs and training camp. So then what's the plan to draft and bring in like guys off the streets? You maybe call Ben Roethlisberger. You know what I'm just kidding. But like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I agree with you with the thought process that if a quarterback is to be moved, probably later on in the season, because also I think I would also agree that if you're going to trade Trey Lance, you're trading him at his lowest possible value, and that feels like so it's a bit of like a obviously roster building, but also a bit of an economics lesson, right? Like, because what we're always going to go back to is how much was given up for Trey, and then getting 4 games out of Trey, and then we trade him for a fraction of that value. That's, I think, going to be the hardest part to swallow. Not only that, but it's like, man, what could Trey have been like? And I think those are the questions that will be out for a long time. So my hope is he at least gets a shot to compete at OTAs in training camp, and then they open up those discussions potentially. Um, because at the end of the day, we don't know what Sam is. Like, Sam shows glimpses that he can do it, but that's been Sam's MO since coming out of USC is glimpses. Well, what's Trey? Glimpses as well. So it's like it's fascinating, man. Like do you think that Kyle values one of these guys more than the other?
I honestly think Kyle doesn't give a rip about any of them. He just wants to play whoever can suit his needs at the moment. This is where it gets interesting, Brad, because so we have these arguments all the time, either, through our chats or on Twitter, and we're like, there's no way you can call Trey Lance a bust after 4 starts. And there's no way that you can call Brock Purdy after 9 games the future of the franchise. Well, the 49ers, if they trade Trey Lance and then they say, hey, Brock Purdy's our future, they've done both of those things, which would be absolutely crazy. So they better be 100% right, because if the off chance, let's say he does end up with Shane Steichen and the Colts, are you betting that Shane Steichen, who just developed Jalen Hurts, isn't going to do the same thing with Trey Lance, who has all the same skill sets? That would be weird. So yeah, if he goes somewhere and blows up and then Brock Purdy maybe comes back down to earth, dude, it could get real ugly real quick. So they better know. And with that short amount of time, man, I wouldn't bet on it.
My goodness, it is such a fun time covering the San Francisco 49ers quarterback position, because there's always variables. There's always some kind of something going on that you always have to consider. And that 100% is one of the things. And it's like, if you were to trade him to the Colts, I mean, you're trading him to a run heavy team with Jonathan Taylor. They want to run the football. So that benefits what I think Trey Lance is good at, like being able to play under center, play action, boots, nakeds, hand the ball off to one of the best running backs in the league. You have Pittman, huge catch radius. I think that's perfect for Trey, because I do think he's still working on like the intricacies of his accuracy. Like, he can get the ball there. It's like, well, we want the ball on the upfield outside shoulder away from the defender. I think that's where he's still kind of developing his game, but you just get it in the vicinity of Pittman, that man's going up and snagging it. So it's like, there is a world that exists that maybe a change of scenery does help him. And he is still younger than most of these draft prospects, right? Like, he's still like younger.
He's younger than Brock Purdy.
He's younger than Brock Purdy. He's younger than Will Levis, I think. So I agree though on the Will Levis take. So I can't say it with my full chest, because I haven't watched enough Will Levis. I can only really like gauge him on seeing him at the scouting combine. And I get Paxton Lynch vibes. Now, I feel like that's putting too much on him because I haven't watched him enough to be like, I thought Paxton Lynch was an insta bust. So I don't want to give him that tag. I get vibes though. I'll just say the vibes from Will was like, he was super inconsistent throwing on air. And I'm like, ooh, obviously the lights are bright and all that stuff. But then also I'm like, well, there's a D2 kid here at the combine, and he was probably one of the most consistent throwers of the entire group. So I'm like, is that an excuse? So I am a little bit hesitant on Will Levis, but I do think it is the big three, and anyone outside of that is trading out. And I wouldn't be shocked if Will goes in the 20s, or I think that's where he should go. Will he go? Positional value probably bumps him up a little bit, but man, this whole quarterback thing is fascinating because trades only materialize based on what the rest of the league is doing. You can't just force a trade like Madden. You have to actually have someone with that matching need. What was it, last year? It was before the combine, it was Washington Commanders and Jimmy Garoppolo before
Right.
the surgery. And they're like,
Yeah.
no one wants to go play quarterback for Washington, and the 49ers need someone to trade at the highest value for Jimmy. And it was like, oh, match made in heaven. Boom, surgery. Like, okay, well, that's not happening. So that's part of it, right? That there has to be someone willing to take on Trey Lance. Do you think across the league there are teams that would absolutely do that right now?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think so, because just looking at Trey Lance as a prospect, which is kind of what you got to do at this point, you've got to act as if he is in this draft and he's a prospect. Where would you have put him on the pantheon of other players? That's the question. And so because of that, I can't imagine he would rank worse than Will Levis. I mean, if Trey Lance was in this draft, would he be the third quarterback taken, the fourth quarterback taken? And that's what we can go off of right now. We have limited NFL film. We've seen some good things in spots. We've seen some shaky things in spots, and that's really all you can go off of. So I don't know, man. If I'm the Colts, I feel really good about giving up 35 for Trey Lance over 4 for Levis. I feel much better about that situation.
Yeah, the Colts have monstrous issues on the O line. Maybe they trade back a little bit, or they go out and they take one of the blue chip offensive tackles to try to shore up their O line. They were all out of whack last year, and then they go out and maybe get Trey with the 35. Oh man, it's so outside of the trade conversation, because it's pure speculation. What is just your evaluation of Trey up until this point? Like, where do you think the disconnect is with, like, at least how I'm perceiving it? Feels like there's a bit of a disconnect between maybe Trey and the messaging coming out of the org. I don't know if you feel that way or not, but just kind of like, I know for a fact, like, you're a big fan of Trey. So I just want to kind of get your thoughts about Trey kind of as a player in of himself.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a disconnect in the messaging. You can't say that we were going to turn the franchise over to this kid comfortably last year, and we still feel all the same ways about it. But now he's competing with Sam Darnold to start maybe a game or two. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so there's definitely a disconnect there. And I don't think it's his fault at all. And quite frankly, I mean, injury happens, and because it happened, it just changed the landscape of everything. If Trey doesn't get injured, nobody even knows who Brock Purdy is at this point. I mean, that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
Because even if he had gotten benched late in the year, Jimmy Garoppolo would have came in. Let's say he stays healthy. You know what I mean? This whole thing changes, but everything happens for a reason. We'll see how it plays out. But I haven't lost any hope or thought in Trey. And it's funny because I think a lot of people kind of try to go back and change history or change what they're seeing. A lot of people seem, at least when I talk to them, they revert back to year one because we didn't see much of him this year. So when they talk about Trey, they say things like, well, he's got happy feet in the pocket. He's really, he's antsy in the pocket. He is not calm in the pocket. He can't go through his progressions. And I think a lot of those things are either what you thought of him coming out of college or what you saw in year one. But the reality of the situation is when you look at Trey Lance in year one, and then you look at him in that Chicago game, a little bit in the preseason, you actually saw it, and then to begin the Seattle game, his pocket presence completely did a 180. I mean, he went from being I call it organized chaos in the pocket, where it's like, man, that looks a little shaky, but he's obviously making
You
it
can
work.
tell when
But
someone's uncomfortable, right?
right, you could tell. I was uncomfortable watching it. But when you watch him in the second year in that short time span, man, he's calm, both hands on the ball. Somebody comes around, grabs his shoulder, he just shrugs it off, steps up cleanly in the pocket, eyes downfield. That's a major jump from year one to year two. Then you see the shortening of the throwing motion. Now, I would say there's still some things to work on. You'd like to marry the legs with the upper body a little bit more, but that comes with time. You also, if you watch him, you can see him go through his progressions and he does it very clean. He doesn't necessarily trust what he's seeing, but he does see the field fine. So I think that there's still all the things that I liked about Trey coming out of the draft. You're starting to see in little bits and pieces come to fruition. You just not seeing it over a span because we haven't even seen 2 straight starts and finishes from the kid yet. How much do you expect to see? And a lot of people want to see it right away. And then you add in the fact that you did see it right away with Brock Purdy. That adds pressure of like, well, we wanted to see it right away. And then we did see it right away with Brock Purdy. So why can't we see that with our number 3 overall pick? He must be a bust. It's like, well, take it easy. There's some things that he can learn. The upside certainly there. The mental capacity is certainly there. I think the temperament, the leadership, all of the things align. He just needs playing time. And we'll see. I mean, he may get it with the 49ers and he may not.
Yeah, it's going to be the big question of this offseason. Obviously, I would say that the messaging kind of put me on edge a little bit. Like, obviously, it kind of felt like that with the way Brock Purdy had played. And, like, from my perspective, I haven't seen a 49ers quarterback play like Brock Purdy did. Granted, very small sample size since Kyle's taken over for the team. Like, I thought he played better than anything Jimmy Garoppolo had really
Yeah.
put together on tape. I thought he was processing at a higher level than what Jimmy Garoppolo had ever put on tape. So I'm like, okay, like I can see the justifications, but it's like, man, it's just really hard because on the other hand, you have this like potential gem of an asset, but there's a lot of polishing that needs to go into like really showing its true beauty. And it's like, what do we always talk about? It comes back to reps, but we got a team that is Super Bowl ready and feels like they're going to be competing for a Super Bowl every year. But it's like, do we go the Josh Allen route and stick him out there year 1, year 2, and hope year 3 everything clicks? Does it click faster? Like, it's become like a difficult situation, at least from us on the outside looking in, who don't watch every rep of his practice, don't get to see it day in and day out and be like, oh, we can make a better evaluation. We can only make the evaluation off the 4 games, what we've seen in training camp and preseason, and then also what they tell us. So it's like, it's a lot to work through, right? So it's like, and at the end of the day, we know he needs reps. And so hopefully heading into training camp and he gets that opportunity. I hope he doesn't get traded before training camp. I hope he doesn't get traded this year. I think my personal take on it is give him this year. We don't know what's going to happen with all 3 of these quarterbacks. Who knows? Keep all 3. We saw them roster 3 last year and just see what happens. Then at the end of the year, who knows? Like maybe one of these dominoes falls where Brock gets hurt, Trey bumps in, and Trey just explodes and like takes over. You're like, how I don't want to lose out on that potential. Or like, you know what I mean? It's just one of those really hard decisions with the quarterback.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird situation. But I also want to point this out because I think a lot was made when Sam Darnold was signed. It was like, oh, you're going to guarantee, what is it, $3.5 million? Is that the guarantee?
Yeah, with the ability to make up to 11 and
11.
playtime incentives.
Yeah. So when he was signed, it was like, oh man, 3.5, that's a lot. There's no way that he's not competing to be the starter or what have you. The 49ers just a year ago. Now remember, the salary cap was smaller. So 2.5 million to 3.5 million a year later with the inflation is roughly the same. Just cut Nate Sudfeld, who had a guaranteed contract as well, because they didn't expect Brock Purdy to come out of nowhere. Maybe they draft a guy that kind of comes out of nowhere, plays well, and then Sam Darnold just gets outright cut. because they
Like,
want to do what's best
they
for Sam
took
Darnold so we can find a team. I wouldn't be
yeah.
shocked.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, Dan, this thing's going to be fascinating because I agree. More quarterbacks are coming in, like before they're going out. So that's the other thing that we got to keep an eye on. So it'll be fascinating.
Okay,
But
I
let's
want
kind
to
of
add this just real quick though. A lot of people, at least for me, I don't know, I couldn't help but to notice it. But when Sam Darnold was signed, I thought to myself, man, this is a kid that they've loved since the draft. They tried to trade for him when he was on the Jets. Then they drafted Trey Lance. And then the first chance they get to bring in Sam Darnold, they brought him in. They've now told you through Trey Lance and Sam Darnold, if they're building an archetype of a quarterback, it's not Jimmy Garoppolo and Brock Purdy archetype. It is Trey Lance, Sam Darnold archetype. So it was interesting to me to see them bring in a player who is more similar to Trey Lance than one Brock Purdy. Sam Darnold has games where he's rushed for 80 plus yards in a game. Now, this is a more athletic player than what I think what people realize. If he was to play for a full season, he'd put up 500 plus rushing yards. You're not getting that from a Brock Purdy. You are getting that from a Trey Lance. So I did find that a little interesting. It's like, well, what do you actually want in a quarterback? Wouldn't you want a guy that fits more what a Brock Purdy's doing? If you were really just going to dump Trey and get rid of him, wouldn't you go all in on Taylor Heineke? You know what I mean? Like, why Sam Darnold? Why Trey Lance? What is it about that archetype that you like, but you're putting your whole franchise into a completely different style of quarterback? I don't know. The whole thing's interesting to me.
No, I agree, and I had to hop into the tape because, like, I like the idea of bringing in Sam Darnold as a quarterback 3, like,
Mm-hmm.
prior to it happening. Then it happens, and I'm like, "All right, I gotta go actually go watch Sam Darnold." And so I'm watching, and I must have picked his best game. It was Bucks versus Panthers,
Oh,
and
it was his best game. Yep.
he had, like, 2 or 3 Sam Darnold throws. But when you're watching him, I'm like, I know why Kyle likes this guy. Like, I can see it. Like, I can see how that ball just jumps out of his hand. Like, it doesn't matter. His feet don't have to be set. They could be pointing east, west, and he's throwing a dart outside the numbers. I'm like, okay, I see that. I see the mobility in the pocket, being able to escape, step up into the pocket, deliver. I'm like, okay, I see that there. The screen game, I think, is one of the most underrated aspects because with Jimmy Garoppolo, the screen game was like a fraction of, I think, what it could be because he was so inaccurate at throwing laterally. I don't know why, but it just never was on target. With Sam, I'm watching him. I'm like, everything's coming out on a line, on a dart. I'm like, oh my, Kyle's loving this stuff. It's the decision making with Sam that you don't love, but I think just like I know, Kyle thinks that he can take the decision making processes out and turn them into kind of like a robot in a sense. Here are your checks. This is what you do. Don't think too much outside of it. Just make sure you're able to maneuver in the pocket, find the open guy. And if you're following my timing and the wide receivers are doing what they're supposed to based on the look we're getting, it's going to work, right? Wouldn't you say that's how Kyle Shanahan would approach it? So that's the thing. It's like looking at what Sam is capable of still physically. If they can fine tune him to be a fraction of like what Brock Purdy is as a processor, Sam Darnold is a better athlete than Brock Purdy. He can throw farther. He can move better, just like you said. So, man, this quarterback situation, I keep saying it. Get your popcorn ready, man. It's gonna be because to your point too. I do think Kyle likes Sam a whole lot. That
Of
we
course he
we can't
does.
we can't just sweep under the rug like Kyle. The Shanahans in general, the Shanahans love Darnold. So it's gonna be fascinating, man.
There's something about coaches in the NFL, and they all the good ones have an ego. They do, and there's nothing wrong with it.
You
But
have to.
you
It's a bunch of
know that
alpha stuff.
Shanahan is looking at Sam Darnold just like the Panthers looked at Sam Darnold. Were like the Jets, they'll Adam Gase. Of course, we can get more out of Sam Darnold than they did. And then you fast forward to Shanahan. He's going, that franchise and that franchise, you couldn't make it work with this athlete. all get the best out of Sam Darnold. So there's an ego thing that goes into it. And I have no doubt if Sam Darnold had to play or somehow won the starting job for a few games, it would probably be the best Sam Darnold you've ever seen. Doesn't mean that Sam Darnold is all of a sudden a good quarterback, though. Those are two different things, because something about Shanahan, he gets the best out of everybody when they are in his system, but these quarterbacks aren't better when they leave. So just keep that in mind. Sam Darnold is still Sam Darnold. He has that, I call it, he's just got that gunslinger mindset to him. Now, unlike Jimmy, he can make some of those throws physically, but I don't necessarily know if that's the mentality you want from a guy who's been a poor decision maker his whole career. He'll give you a few.
That's his biggest thing. It's confidence and decision making, processing, but that's the thing that I knocked him on. Like, I was like, man, I don't like Sam Darnold as a prospect, because I thought that that's where kind of his issue lied. So it was fascinating, but I do want to kind of touch on this topic, and I'll have this be our last topic. I don't want to keep you too long. I've already got you going on an hour, so I want to get you out of here so you can eat your dinner and spend time with your family and all that type of good stuff. But obviously, Kyle Shanahan with the JT O'Sullivan stuff, the I don't know if you guys saw it or not. It was April Fool's, but there was a lot of truth in what he was saying, and he was. I don't think it was totally joking. I think he was taking genuine shots. At least that's the way it came across. But of course, he talked about real stuff. Like he was breaking down the tape, all that type of stuff. Obviously, we've had we talk about sample size with these quarterbacks not having enough sample size. We have enough sample size for Kyle Shanahan. I'm going to start with a big question, and then we can kind of drill it down. Will the 49ers ever win a Super Bowl with Kyle Shanahan as the head coach?
Man, it's hard to win Super Bowls for anybody. I mean, if it was easy, then everybody would do it. And the 49ers are living proof of this. I mean, not just with Shanahan, but with Harbaugh. How many times are we going to say, what is this, probably the sixth season in the last 12 years that we've looked at and said, yeah, the 49ers were the second best team in the league, man. They just couldn't be the best team, unfortunately. That's what it feels like. It felt like 3 years that happened with Harbaugh. It seems like 3 years again that's happening with Shanahan. So it is really hard to go from second to first, clearly. Yeah. Otherwise, it would have happened by now. I don't want to say no for sure, but if I had to bet, you're putting me on the spot. You're making me bet. I'm going to say no. With the 49ers, I don't think he will. And the only reason is he hasn't figured out the quarterback spot. And maybe Brock Purdy's something that I'm not seeing for whatever reason. Or maybe Trey ends up panning out and being everything that I did think that he was. But outside of that, I mean, if for some reason Trey Lance and Brock Purdy aren't that franchise caliber quarterback, it's so hard to win in the league when you don't have those guys. And the 49ers easily could continue to be the team that comes out of the NFC. But when you come out of the NFC, you're going to face a Mahomes, a Lamar, a Herbert, a Burrow, an Allen. I don't like my chances against any of those guys. These guys can score in 15 seconds or less with no timeouts. We haven't had that what Steve Young is that? I mean, if Steve Young played today, he could probably make that happen. But man, it's really hard to overcome those guys in an offensive driven league. I don't see it. So, Shanahan to me, I think is a really good coach. There's not many guys I'd put above him. That's for sure. He's not perfect by any means, but I really am starting to get that feeling like you got with Andy Reid, where it's like, he's doing so many good things. You kind of want to keep him forever, but at some point you got to let him go, and then he'll spread his wings somewhere else. He'll land with a perfect quarterback and he'll win himself a Super Bowl. That's the unfortunate feeling. That's the feeling I'm starting to get from Shanahan.
So the same feeling that we potentially have with Trey Lance, we could have the same feeling with Kyle Shanahan, meaning the 49ers just aren't going to have nice things is basically what it comes down to.
Now, I hope I'm wrong. I really, but and I don't want to hem and high. That's not who I am. I always try to at least
100%.
pick a lane. I don't want to be that guy that just plays it down
It's
the
a
middle. It's like,
broad
well, I
question.
mean, maybe,
It's a broad
possibly.
question, man.
You put my back against the wall, Brad, but I
did,
have to
100%.
give my genuine opinion. And if I had to make a bet, I would say no, it doesn't happen in San Francisco.
Hey, you passed the test, and that's again. This is honestly why, like, I love having you on, is because, like, of course, it's not going to be the popular answer. Like saying, like, "Oh no, it's not going to happen here." Like, but that's you're processing it. And again, you started talking about Kyle Shanahan at the beginning of the show, saying, like, "Man, this dude knows how to build rosters. He knows how to build staffs," which is another really important aspect of being a head coach. It's like we put so much emphasis on the roster building. Look at the staffs that he's built. Look at the head coaches that have come from his coaching tree. Look at the like the breaks off his coaching tree. The McVays, the O'Donnell or whatever, the O'Donnell's, O'Connell, Minnesota head coach.
Yeah, O'Connell. Yeah,
But so that's another hard aspect of it. But again, it all comes back to the most important position, arguably, in all of sports. It's we know this team is capable of winning week in and week out. It's when those games that are, again, all the marbles, everything's right there in front of you. And again, will the most, excuse my, I don't swear on this channel a whole lot, but it's true. The most fucked up thing about the Philly game is we just don't know if Brock could have done it. We just don't know, and we'll never know. And like that could have been the break, the floodgates breaking open, and that could have been them potentially getting over the hump on this magical run. But it all comes down to a play that he called where Brock Purdy got hurt on, and now the emphasis is on, like, oh, we were not that close. It's like, damn, you called a bad play. Like, we shouldn't have had a tight end. I think all things are fair, but it's like, it's just crazy, man. It's like we are so close, but it's like, what is going to be the tipping point to get us to the top? Like what? And I think you know just as well as I do, there's luck needed on all these runs, right? Like, and the 49ers got dealt a bad hand of luck, if you want to call it. Like, let's say that was just a sack, like on the play where Brock gets hurt, Brock stands up, and we keep going. Who knows what would have happened in that game? But again, the most unfortunate, catastrophic thing that could have happened ultimately did. And so it's just a situation, right, where it's like we see that his ability to build a staff, the players seem to have respect for him, and everything he's able to do from a roster standpoint. But it's like after 6 years, we still don't know what's going on with the quarterback. And what was the problem with like Andy Reid, right? Like who he's always comped to now, even with Donovan McNabb, they just weren't able to get over the mountaintop. Do you see Jed York ever moving on from Kyle Shanahan? It feels like, I feel like Jed, I'll answer this question myself and then I'll give you a turn. But I feel like Jed, after what he went through with Harbaugh, it feels like he's going to give Kyle the leash. But again, what do you think about Kyle's future with this team?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a while. I mean, I really could see a Marvin Lewis, Andy Reid situation where he's here for many, many years. Really, anything short of, I would say, if he misses the playoffs in back-to-back years, okay, you probably will see a change at some point. But if he continues to put out competitive teams year in and year out, if John Lynch is still around, that's going to be the indicator. If John Lynch gets let go, then you know Shanahan's on the hot seat. But you may not know that because John Lynch might go and be in TV next year. And so that makes it really hard to gauge. But like I said, I would say back-to-back years missing the playoffs. And I want to go back for a second. You were talking about the NFC Championship. And you're right, we really don't know. That is the most unfortunate thing about the Brock Purdy injury, it's not just we don't know about last year. It leaves all questions open for this year. If Brock Purdy had fallen on his face in that NFC Championship, played awful, and they got beat, you'd be like, you know what? It was a cool story, but we still believe in Trey Lance. And we have a path here probably with Trey Lance. We're going to let Brock Purdy compete, but Trey's kind of still our guy. Or, hey, Brock Purdy played really good. They go to the Super Bowl. Even if they lose the Super Bowl, Purdy plays fine. He shows the moment's not too big. All right, you feel a little bit more comfortable projecting what Brock Purdy will eventually be. Because it ended the way that it did, not only do we not know what could have been last year, we don't know what will be going forward. There's a lot of open-ended questions because of that play that are lingering into this season and potentially the next 3 to 5 seasons for the 49ers because they just don't know.
I mean, talk about butterfly effect, right? Like, and just like how one thing has such an insane trajectory on multiple different variables, like for the 49ers. And I think you explained it perfectly. We don't know. And that could have changed. And I remember like getting on my live, I was in Philly. I get back to my room and I'm like, if this is a serious injury, everything is open at quarterback. I started talking about Tom Brady that post game, and I'm like, I can't believe I'm talking about Tom Brady because like it felt like we had finally found, at least for now, someone who could drive the ship in Brock Purdy. And if he was able to get over that hump, beat Philly, get into the Super Bowl, who knows what would happen. But because that injury occurred, I remember I was like, this leaves everything open. If this is a UCL tear, Tommy John, I was saying more in the sense of Tommy John. I'm like, that leaves every option open because Trey Lance is coming back from an ankle injury. So it's like they still have to be sure that Trey is back to full health and doesn't have any, injuries can take a toll mentally. So it's like both quarterbacks now are having, oh gosh.
You know what? It does feel weird talking about Tom Brady, especially now that he's retired again. You know what feels right though, Brad? Talking about Kirk Cousins, doesn't it? Doesn't it just feel also right?
You want to know this wild ass thought that I've had that I haven't put out yet in relation to like the Kirk Cousin rumors? I kind of feel like because they have Sam Darnold, like that itched Kyle Shanahan's like Kirk Cousins, Sam Darnold. He's like, well, look at what the price we got on Sam Darnold. Like, look, because I mean, you look at Kirk Cousins, dude, what is this? I don't even know what his cap hit is. It's like astronomical. So like I don't even know if it's feasible, or what has to be done from Parag Marate.
Well, I think it is actually, oddly enough, because Aaron, and I don't know exactly what it would be to his new team. I think I looked it up and it wasn't that bad, but you look at Aaron Rodgers, for example, his cap hit for the Packers is like 38 million. When he gets traded, if he doesn't rework his deal, it's less than 16 million this year to the Jets because they've got to eat a lot of that. So if Minnesota has to eat a lot of that, yeah, his cap number is astronomical to them, but it's not going to stay that when he gets traded. Some of that is going to go to the Vikings. So the possibility is actually there. And we talked about fits for Trey Lance. I mean, is there a better fit as far as where he's from than Minnesota? I can't think of one.
Oh, they love Trey Lance is a superstar in Minnesota. Like, so that's all right. You got me thinking, Jesse. I got to do a little bit more research.
I don't want to put it out in the ether that Kirk Cousins is coming. It just seems funny to me. It's like, can't you see that Shanahan 6 years ago, when he said that he was actually upset that they got Jimmy Garoppolo because they couldn't get Kirk Cousins? Like this was his own words. Like, I really had to lock myself in a room for a few days and figure things out. At that point, when he left that room finally and was able to go back to the world, he said to himself, you know what? If you love something, you got to let it go. And if it comes back, it's meant to be. And here we are 6 years later, and Kirk Cousins is an actual possibility for the San Francisco 49ers. You can't make this stuff up.
And there is a natural connection because who's their GM, came from the 49ers front office. So it's like Oh God. Never a dull moment at all covering the San Francisco 49ers. And again, I think there's going to be a lot to discuss for the rest of the offseason. But I do want to let you get out of here, go spend time with your family and do all that kind of good stuff. Get some dinner inside of you. But first of all, man, if you guys aren't following Jesse on Twitter or sub to his channel at Last Second Sports on YouTube, please go over and do that. I promise you, you'll be a better fan for it. Thank you, Jesse, for hopping on, man. I know we have busy schedules with the way the content stuff works out, and work schedules and all that. So I just thank you for hopping on, man. This was a great conversation. It went exactly how I thought it was going to go, and I'm very pleased about that.
Yeah, we've always had some good back and forth on Twitter and in the DMs and whatever. So I figured it would flow pretty easily. It definitely went exactly how I expected. Brad, thank you so much for having me on, man. You are doing incredible things over here. It's really cool to see you cut your chops on the news and 95.7 and just kind of branch out. You've got national guys reaching out to you. You've done a really, really good job, man. Nothing but the sky is the limit for you. I just, it's so good to see other content creators make a path for themselves, be successful. You're a business owner. You own your own business and you've done it all from scratch. It's really impressive, man. Shout out to you. I'm very, very happy for you, Brad.
Hit me right in the feels, Jesse. I appreciate you, brother, but I'm really excited for hopefully this relationship to continue to build, hopefully get you on the channel a little bit more often. Obviously, a lot of scheduling to work out, but you are the man, Jesse. Appreciate you all your time. And again, make sure you go sub to my guy. 10,000 subs. I mean, that's impressive, bro. Like, again, like there's a way that I went about building a channel, but building your channel the way that you've gone about it it's I cannot stress how hard it is to do it like in such an organic way that is only you. And I applaud anyone who can do that because it is not easy. So shout out to you, my guy. And again, if you guys aren't, if any of the SDS are out here and you're not following to this guy, go follow. And again, I don't always agree with everything Jesse's got to say, but I know it's coming from a good place. That's my guy. Appreciate you so much, Jesse. And again, shout out to all the SDS for checking in for live number 2 of today. But that's it for today. We're out of here. Peace. Smash that like button if you haven't already. Love to see you.